The night I came home with my name on a building, my father still introduced me as my daughter who works in tech. Not the founder, not the CEO, just my daughter who works in tech, the same way he'd been saying it since I graduated from Stanford 12 years ago. Like I was still 22 and carrying a laptop bag to some entry-level job downtown. I remember standing in my parents' living room in Palo Alto, still in the blazer I'd worn to the ribbon-cutting ceremony that morning, and watching my father shake hands with our neighbor Gerald. Gerald, who had just retired from a mid-level position at Cisco. Gerald, who my father treated like a visiting dignitary. And I heard those words come out of his mouth, and I just stood there, smiling, the way I always did. My mother caught my eye from across the room. She gave me that look she'd been giving me my whole life. The one that said, "I know, sweetheart, I know." But she didn't say anything. She never said anything. That was October, 3 months before the dinner that changed everything. I need to back up a little, because none of this makes sense without understanding who my father is. Or rather, who he believes himself to be. My father, Richard, grew up in Naperville, Illinois, the son of a factory supervisor, and he worked his way up to become a regional sales director for a pharmaceutical company. He retired at 63 with a solid pension and a golf handicap he talked about more than he talked about his children. He is not a bad man. I want to be clear about that. He coached my brother's little league team. He drove me to piano lessons every Saturday for 6 years. He remembered birthdays and showed up to things. But there was always this. I don't know how to describe it. This ceiling he had in his mind for me specifically. Not for my brother. Never for my brother. When my brother Marcus got his real estate license at 24, my father took him to dinner at Gibson's Steakhouse in Chicago and ordered a bottle of Canis. When I closed my Series A funding round at 27, $4 million from investors who believed in what I was building, my father called to say, "That's nice, honey," and then asked if I was still seeing that guy from my MBA program. I wasn't. I hadn't been for 2 years, but that's beside the point. The point is that in my father's mental universe, certain things registered as achievement and certain things didn't. And whatever I did, it had a way of falling into the second category. My company, Lumen Health, built software that helped rural hospitals manage patient data more efficiently. I know that doesn't sound glamorous. It isn't. It's not the kind of thing that makes sense at a dinner party when you're trying to explain what you do. But what it meant, practically, was that a critical access hospital in rural Montana could track medication errors the same way a major medical center in Chicago could. It meant people didn't fall through cracks because their small-town hospital was running on spreadsheets from 2009. By the time I was 34, we had contracts with over 200 hospitals across 31 states. We had 112 employees. We had just been named to Forbes's list of most innovative healthcare companies for the second year running. And my father was proud of Marcus for flipping a 3-bedroom in Evanston. I had made peace with this. Or I thought I had. You spend enough years accommodating a dynamic, and you start to mistake endurance for acceptance. I told myself it didn't matter. I had built something real. I had people who counted on me. I had a board of directors who flew in from New York to hear me speak. I didn't need my father to understand any of it. Then came the Whitmore Foundation Gala. The Whitmore Foundation is one of the largest private healthcare philanthropies in the country. Every January they hold their annual gala at the Palmer House in Chicago. Black tie, 600 guests, a mix of hospital executives, major donors, and people from the policy world. It is, genuinely, one of the most important nights in healthcare philanthropy. And getting an invitation is not something that happens by accident. I had been invited because Lumen Health had just signed a partnership agreement with the foundation to expand our software platform to underserved hospitals in Appalachia and the Mississippi Delta. It was the biggest deal we'd ever done. It meant our software would reach communities where, honestly, people were dying from things they shouldn't be dying from, because their hospitals didn't have the infrastructure to catch problems early enough. I was being honored that night, not in a small way. The foundation was giving me their annual Innovation in Healthcare Award, which came with a $250,000 grant and, more importantly, a spotlight. National press, board members from major hospital systems, the kind of attention that opens doors you didn't even know existed. I had told my family about the gala weeks in advance. My mother immediately said she wanted to come. My brother said he'd try to make it. My father said he'd see. That January was a busy time for him, by which he meant the golf resort in Scottsdale, where he and his buddies did a winter trip every year. He ended up rearranging his trip by 2 days. I want to be fair and acknowledge that. He came. What I didn't anticipate was who else he would spend the evening trying to impress. We arrived at the Palmer house together. My parents, my brother Marcus, and my business partner Diane, who had flown in from San Francisco and who I could not have built any of this without. The lobby of the Palmer house is extraordinary if you've never been. The ceiling is painted like the Sistine Chapel, almost. It stops you. My father stopped, looked up, then immediately began scanning the room for people to recognize. He spotted Harold Dunmore almost immediately. Harold Dunmore was at the time, the CFO of Meridian Health Partners, one of the largest hospital network operators in the Midwest. He is the kind of man who fills a room without trying. White-haired, broad-shouldered, the sort of handshake that makes you feel like you've just been approved for something. My father had met him exactly once, at a pharmaceutical conference 8 years ago. But the way my father lit up when he saw him, you would have thought they'd been fishing buddies for decades. Harold! My father's voice carried across the lobby in a way that made my mother touch her pearls. Harold Dunmore turned, looked pleasantly confused for half a second, then placed him. Richard, good to see you. Polite. Professional. The kind of warm that costs nothing. My father crossed the marble floor to shake Harold's hand and I watched him transform into a version of himself I had seen 100 times. Deferential, eager. The man who had sold pharmaceutical products to executives for 30 years. Turning on a version of charm that was different from the one he used at home. More effortful, more aimed. I started to follow. Harold Dunmore was actually someone I needed to speak with that evening, because Meridian Health Partners was a potential expansion partner for our next phase. But my father glanced back at me and said, almost under his breath, "Give us a minute, sweetheart. Harold's a very important man." Diane, standing next to me, didn't say anything, but I felt her go very still. I stopped walking. My mother appeared at my elbow and steered me gently toward the coat check, the way she had been steering me away from things my whole life. "He doesn't mean anything by it," she said. "I know," I said, and the strange thing is, I did know. That was the worst part. I had known for so long that it had stopped even feeling like pain, it just felt like weather. The cocktail hour was in the grand ballroom foyer, and it was the kind of Chicago January night that makes you understand why the city built so much beauty indoors. The chandeliers were enormous. The bar was full. The energy was that particular mix of genuine purpose and performance that you get at events where powerful people are trying to do good things while also being seen doing good things. I spent the first 40 minutes working the room the way I always did. Talking to hospital administrators, reconnecting with a foundation board member I'd met in DC the previous spring, having a real conversation with a woman who ran a nonprofit in eastern Kentucky whose work intersected directly with what we were doing in Appalachia. This is the part of my job I genuinely love, not the awards, not the spotlight. The moment when you're talking to someone who's been in the trenches and you realize your tools might actually help them. I lost track of my father during this time. I assumed he was with Harold Dunmore or my brother or some combination. I wasn't worried, then I heard him. Not his words, at first. Just his voice, carrying that particular register he used when he was performing Confidence. Slightly too loud, slightly too smooth. I turned and saw him standing near the entrance to the main ballroom with Marcus beside him, and they were talking to a man I recognized immediately. James Whitmore III, the grandson of the foundation's founder and its current chairman. James was in his late 50s, elegant in the way that people who have never had to try to be elegant often are, and he was listening to my father with the patient attention of someone who has spent a lifetime being approached by people at events like this. I started moving toward them. Not for any particular reason. Just. They were my family, and James Whitmore was someone I was going to be on a stage with in approximately 90 minutes. I was maybe 20 feet away when my father said it. "She's very sweet, but she's always been more of a behind-the-scenes person. Not really cut out for the big stage, you know?" He laughed a little. "Now Marcus here. Marcus just closed on a development deal in Lincoln Park that is going to be something special." James Whitmore nodded. The polite nod of a man processing information he didn't ask for. I stopped walking. 20 feet away, in a room full of people who knew exactly who I was and why I was there. My father was explaining to the chairman of the Whitmore Foundation that his daughter was not really cut out for the big stage. I thought about turning around. I thought about finding Diane and having another glass of wine and letting it go the way I had let 1,000 things go before this. But Marcus saw me. His face did something complicated. Surprise, guilt. A flash of something I might call shame, and he said quietly, "Dad." My father turned. For a moment he looked confused, the way people do when their two worlds collide unexpectedly. Then he smiled the way he always smiled when he saw me. warm, automatic. There she is. We were just talking about I heard, I said. And I don't know why, but I didn't look at my father when I said it. I looked at James Whitmore, and James Whitmore looked back at me with an expression that I would spend a long time thinking about afterward. Not pity, not embarrassment on my behalf, something quieter and more complicated than that. Mr. Whitmore, I said. I'm Natalie. I'm looking forward to speaking with you before the program begins. I'd love to walk you through what we're hoping to accomplish with the Appalachian expansion, if you have a few minutes. And James Whitmore, chairman of the foundation, grandson of a man who had built one of the most important healthcare philanthropies in the country, extended his hand and said, I was hoping you'd find me. I've been reading about what you've built. The outcomes data from your rural hospital partnerships is extraordinary. I shook his hand. I did not look at my father. We stood there, James Whitmore and I, for nearly 20 minutes. We talked about the access gap in critical access hospitals. We talked about what the data was showing us in the pilot regions. We talked about the possibility of expanding the foundation's partnership beyond what was already contracted, into communities in the Deep South where the need was even more acute. At some point during this conversation, James's wife joined us. Then the foundation's president, then Harold Dunmore, who recognized me immediately. We had spoken twice before, once at a conference in Nashville, and once in a video call about a potential integration with Meridian's EMR system, and who said, Natalie, I've been meaning to reach out about the Mississippi Delta proposal. Can we find time this week? I said we could. I was aware, somewhere in my peripheral vision, that my father was standing a few feet away. I could feel him the way you can feel a room temperature change. I didn't turn around. My mother found me after the cocktail hour, while we were moving to the main ballroom for dinner. She touched my arm, and I turned and her eyes were bright in a way that wasn't quite tears but was close. He didn't know, she said. I know he didn't, I said. He's never really understood what you do. I know that too. She squeezed my arm. Are you all right? I thought about it honestly. Yeah, I said. I actually am. Dinner was round tables of 10 with assigned seating. I was at the head table with James Whitmore and the foundation board. My family was at a table about 4 rows back. I could see them if I turned slightly, which I mostly didn't. The food was the kind of food that appears at galas like this, beautifully presented, competently executed, completely forgettable. Filet mignon, roasted vegetables, a chocolate thing for dessert. I ate maybe half of mine because I was too busy talking to the woman on my left, Dr. Cheryl Okafor, who ran a consortium of rural health clinics in Alabama, and who had more practical knowledge about healthcare access than most of the policy papers I had ever read. Between the salad course and the main course, the foundation's president gave remarks. Between the main course and dessert, they did the award presentations. There were 3. A physician from Boston who had developed a low-cost diagnostic tool for TB detection. A nonprofit leader from New Mexico who had built a mobile clinic network serving indigenous communities. And me. I didn't know exactly what the introduction would say. I had submitted a bio, but the foundation wrote their own remarks and I hadn't seen them. The foundation's president, a woman named Carol Whitfield, who had been running the organization for 11 years, and who I deeply respected, stood at the podium and began talking about Lumen Health. She talked about our founding story, the specific moment that had made me start the company, which was watching a family friend in rural Wisconsin get a preventable diagnosis too late, because the hospital didn't have the systems to catch it earlier. She talked about our growth. She talked about the outcomes data. She talked about what the Appalachia partnership would mean, in real terms, for real people. Then she said, tonight's Innovation in Healthcare Award goes to a woman who has quietly built one of the most important health infrastructure companies in the country. She has done this without fanfare, without a splashy consumer product, without the kind of coverage that usually attaches to people doing work this significant. She has done it because she understood something fundamental, that the gap between who gets good healthcare in this country and who doesn't is a technology problem. And she decided to solve it. Please welcome the founder and CEO of Lumen Health, Natalie. I walked to the podium. The room stood up. 600 people in black tie in the Palmer House Grand Ballroom, and they stood up. I had not expected that. I had prepared remarks, and for a moment, just a moment, I almost lost the thread of them, because I was trying to hold myself together in a way that probably wasn't visible to anyone else in the room, but felt enormous from the inside. I found my mother's face at the table 4 rows back. She was crying, openly, her hand pressed to her mouth. Next to her, my brother Marcus was on his feet with everyone else, clapping, and his expression was something I will carry with me for a long time. Pride, genuine, uncomplicated pride. And my father. My father was standing too. Because everyone was standing, and he was standing with them, the way you stand for something, when the room decides it's worth standing for. But his face was, I don't have a precise word for it. It was the face of a man encountering information that doesn't fit the file he's kept. The face of someone doing math that isn't adding up the way he expected. I looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then I looked at my notes and I began to speak. I talked for 7 minutes. I talked about the family friend in Wisconsin, whose name was Donna, and whose late diagnosis had cost her 2 years of her life that she hadn't had to lose. I talked about what it means when a hospital is under-resourced, not because its staff doesn't care, but because it's running systems that were outdated before some of its nurses graduated from high school. I talked about what we were building and why it mattered and who it was for. I said, the people this work is meant to serve are not the ones in rooms like this one. They are people in places that don't often get talked about at galas, which is exactly why it matters that rooms like this one decide to pay attention to them. I thanked the foundation. I thanked Diane, who stood up from our table when I said her name and got her own applause. I thanked our team. I did not mention my family, not because I was punishing anyone. I want to be clear about that. But because in that moment, thinking about my father's face when he told James Whitmore his daughter wasn't cut out for the big stage, I understood something I had been circling for years without quite landing on it. There are people in your life who see you. And there are people in your life who carry a version of you in their heads that has nothing to do with who you actually are. And no amount of achievement changes the version in their head. It just sits there. That frozen image, that ceiling they built for you before you were old enough to know you didn't have to accept it. Success didn't make my father see me differently. What it did, what that night did, was make visible, to everyone else in the room, the distance between who he believed I was and who I actually was. He embarrassed himself, not me. That sentence, which I didn't say out loud that night, took me years to fully understand. But standing at that podium, I felt it settle into me like something coming to rest after a very long journey. Afterward was the part I hadn't prepared for. There is always an afterward, at events like this, when the formal program ends and the room relaxes, and people drift toward each other with warmer glasses of wine, and the specific relief of having sat in assigned seating for 2 hours. James Whitmore found me near the bar and we talked for another 30 minutes. Harold Dunmore gave me his cell number. Dr. Cheryl Okafor and I exchanged cards and made a plan to speak the following week, which eventually became a formal advisory relationship that shaped the direction of our Alabama expansion. It was somewhere in the middle of all of this that my father appeared at my elbow. I had known he would. I had been waiting for it without quite admitting to myself that I was waiting. Natalie. His voice was different, quieter. The performance register was gone. I turned to look at him. He looked older, standing there, not in the way he had looked during dinner when he was performing Ease. Older in a more honest way. His bow tie was slightly crooked. He was holding a glass of water instead of his usual scotch. That was something, he said. What you've built. I didn't. He stopped, started again. I didn't fully understand what you'd done. I looked at him for a moment. I thought about all the things I could say. I had rehearsed some of them, in a way. Not intentionally, but you rehearse things for years without knowing it, and then the moment comes, and you have all these prepared lines and none of them feel right. I know you didn't. I said. I'm sorry for what I said to James Whitmore. I didn't know he knew you. I noticed that. The apology was for what he'd said to James Whitmore. Not for 34 years of a ceiling. Not for she works in tech. Not for the Series A phone call. Or the hundreds of small moments where my achievements had passed through him and left no mark. But I didn't say any of that. Because here's the thing I've come to understand about fathers like mine. They are not going to give you the apology you actually need. They are going to give you the apology they are capable of giving. And you can spend your life waiting for the bigger one, the real one, the one that acknowledges the full weight of what they withheld from you. Or you can decide that the smaller apology is what's available, and that you don't have to accept it as sufficient, but you also don't have to carry the absence of it forever. It's okay, Dad, I said. It wasn't, entirely, but it was enough for that night. He nodded. There was a moment that was almost an embrace. He half raised his arm and then seemed to lose certainty about what he meant to do with it. He settled for squeezing my shoulder once. Your mother is very proud, he said. I know she is. He drifted back toward Marcus. I watched him go. Diane appeared at my side 30 seconds later the way she has a gift for doing. You okay? She asked. Yeah, I said. And then, more honestly, I think I finally stopped waiting for something. That's big, she said. I know, I said. It took embarrassingly long. She handed me a fresh glass of wine. We tapped glasses. Across the room, James Whitmore caught my eye and gave me a small nod. The kind that means the conversation we were having isn't finished. Let's find time. Harold Dunmore was talking to two people I needed to meet before the night was over. Dr. Okafor was waving me over to introduce me to someone. The room was full of people who saw me exactly as I was. I took a breath and went to meet them. I'm telling this story now because it took me a long time to know how to tell it without it being about my father. Because that's the trap, isn't it? You spend years building something, and then the story you can't stop telling is still about the person who didn't see it. You give them the narrative. You hand them the center of it. This story is not about my father. It's about Donna from Wisconsin who deserved a better diagnosis. It's about the 112 people on my team who show up every day to build something that matters. It's about Dr. Okafor in Alabama, and the hospitals in Appalachia, and the communities that don't get talked about at galas enough. It's about Diane, who believed in what we were building before we had anything to show anyone. It's about what happens when you stop trying to make someone see you and start trusting the people who already do. My father called me the following week. We talked for 20 minutes, the longest phone call we'd had in years that wasn't about a holiday or a logistics question. He asked me to explain, again, what the Appalachian expansion meant. I explained it. He listened in a way he hadn't listened before. It wasn't the conversation I had always wanted us to have. But it was a real one. I'll take real.